I think of Scooter, I think of a sweet, small, thin kid. But when he hit the stage and that light hit him, he was a totally different animal. It was something in his eyes. It was almost like it was past hunger. I think that's what hurt so much when it happened later. I remember them dragging him out the car, and he had like blood coming out his mouth. And I was just screaming, screaming, screaming.
Police here in Baltimore are used to acts of retaliation. This was payback on a whole nother level.
There was a bloody tennis match going back and forth throughout the city.
How many people you gonna hurt? How many people gotta suffer for it to end?
The saying is, if you're going to seek revenge, make sure you dig 2 graves.
June 25th, 2016. At 6:57 p.m., police in Baltimore, Maryland respond to an emergency call near Morgan State University.
We received a phone call from our dispatcher notifying that a shooting had taken place at Harford Road and Moravia Road. We responded out to the location. When we got out there were people everywhere.
The crowd is gathered around a gray Honda that has crashed into a liquor store. Onlookers say the vehicle careened off the road after it was shot at by an unidentified gunman.
The driver's side was literally riddled with bullets. There were a number of bullets struck into the car, into the roof, out the other side. Speaking with the primary officer, they gave me a breakdown about what took place. An adult male had been shot. Adult male was subsequently transported to Johns Hopkins Hospital.
The victim is 23-year-old rapper Tyrese Watson, better known to his fans by his stage name.
Someone came up to me and said that this is Scooter. At that time, I had no idea who Scooter was.
Tyrese Trayvon Watson was born on April 13th, 1993. He grew up near Pennsylvania Avenue in West Baltimore, a neighborhood with strong ties to black music history.
Years ago, I'm talking like the 60s, 70s, you had the biggest names come to do concerts on Pennsylvania Avenue. Frank Sinatra, Commodores. This is where everything took place. Because of the influx of drugs that have infiltrated the community, there has been a fall off.
Young Tyrese's single mother did her best to provide for the family. But growing up poor in a rough part of town was never easy. To escape his surroundings, Tyrese turned to rap music, adopting the stage name Lil Scooter at an early age.
His mother attested to the fact that he would have his headphones on constantly, and he would constantly be writing his lyrics in his notebooks and really living in that space.
He cared a lot about his mother. He put that in his music as well. He wanted the world to know what he's been through, the struggles, him and his mother had, and that his ultimate goal was to help her get in a better situation.
Scooter's rise to stardom would hit a speed bump when, as a teenager, he dropped out of high school and started making poor choices. In 2011, at age 17, he was arrested for drug possession. But this turned out to be a blessing in disguise.
Scooter was placed into a program called the Violence Prevention Initiative, or VPI. That helped guide him away from the continued course. He really took hold of more of the rap music than being involved in drugs.
I think he took up pretty quickly as it pertains to Baltimore. We're a hard town. Like, they always say you can make it here. No, seriously. If you can make it in Baltimore, you have really done it.
The community truly embraced Lil Scooter because they felt he was real. He didn't rap about what he heard someone else talk about. He didn't rap about what he thought would resonate with the people in his community. He rapped about what he lived.
In 2014, Scooter's song Bird Flu became the unofficial anthem of Baltimore's West Side.
While it has various meanings, our sports teams, the Orioles and the Ravens, are both birds. So there are plays on that as well. So it galvanizes people around it from that aspect.
Everybody here, everybody in the state of Maryland believed in this kid. You had athletes dancing to it. You had Diddy shouting him out. You had Meek Mill shouting him out. It was like something the city never seen before.
His success landed him in a prominent Baltimore rap collective.
They were very supportive of Scooter, very supportive of his career. They did everything they need to do to make him that superstar.
Scooter's personal life was thriving as well. In 2015, he started dating fellow West Baltimore musician Taylor Johnson, also known as Sneaky T.
West Baltimore is known for young, fly, and flashy. West Baltimore is like where the fly guys at, where the fly girls at. Getting money guys, getting money girls. So we were kind of always like popular in the city. Both had a name, we had mutual friends, so it kind of just happened. Scooter is a very caring person. Demanding. he was a little demanding, but he was a man. Like, he would get stuff done.
He was really laid back and chill. But when he hit the stage and that light hit him, he was a totally different animal. You could tell that he was in his element. Let's say that.
Scooter and Sneaky T even performed together once.
So we had a booking together, and it was so fun. Just imagine you and your significant other are in the same field. Y'all both getting paid to do what y'all like to do, getting big money to do what you like to do. Y'all both coming home with a bag. Y'all both had, like, it was just, that was a great night.
As his reputation grew, Scooter began using his platform to spread a message of nonviolence.
He was one of the few people that you can actually see making it to the next level. I think Scooter was going to perpetuate that positive attitude and give everybody hope.
You know, he took his craft very seriously, spent a lot of time in the studio, and now he's going to peace rallies, trying to get back to the community, trying to tell kids that are coming behind him, you don't have to go that route.
On June 25th, 2016, the day of the shooting, he was embraced by community leaders as a role model and symbol of Baltimore's future.
Stokey Canaday, he organized a peace rally held at Morgan State University, a very prominent HBCU right here in Baltimore, Maryland. And Lil Scooter was in attendance. He and his girlfriend, he was actually a featured artist, a featured guest at this particular rally.
I felt like a part of my life, I made a lot of poor decisions, and I did things that I'm not or wasn't proud of at the time in my life, and I wanted to give people hope that change was possible. So I wanted to have a basketball game to use these influencers like Scooter to give young fans who wanted to see them do something other than what they normally do. Scooter wasn't a basketball player, but you can tell he was having fun.
For everyone involved, it was a major success. But less than an hour after the rally ended, tragedy struck.
I just remember, being happy that we had another successful event. And then I remember getting a call, leaving the gym, that Scooter got shot.
As Scooter is rushed to the hospital, Baltimore police began questioning potential witnesses. One of them immediately stands out.
My attention was really put toward a woman that was crying, very distraught on the side of the road. Come to find out that was Taylor Johnson, the girlfriend of Lil Scooter.
Taylor says she was in the passenger seat when the vehicle crashed, but is too traumatized to remember exactly what happened.
When the police officer got there, I remember him saying, "What's your name? What's your address? What's your date of birth?" And I was like, "I don't know. I literally did not know. I couldn't tell him nothing." He was like, "Well, can you call somebody? Do you know a number?" And I remember grabbing my phone and dialing. I was calling everybody that was close to me, like, "Come right here."
As friends and family race to the scene, the detective receives devastating news.
He is rushed to the hospital, but despite doctors' greatest efforts, he dies from his injuries.
Casey, welcome to the U.S. Marshals.
Try to keep up. You picked hell of a day to leave the ranch.
All my love scattered everywhere.
When he looked at me, I just melted.
Dreams so sweet turned into a nightmare.
I didn't suspect that he was a straight-out killer demon. I knew I was in trouble.
I've been going crazy.
That's a hell of a price to pay. Just for one damn man.
Baltimore police are investigating the death of rapper Lor Skuta, shot by an unknown gunman on his way home from a peace rally.
We had about 11 shell casings that were located in the intersection. Were right at the light. The caliber of gun we discovered was a .40 caliber handgun. There were no shell casings in the vehicle, which leads us to understand that the shooters were clearly on the outside of the vehicle. All the shots were coming in from the driver's side into the vehicle.
His girlfriend, who was sitting right next to him in the passenger seat, left the scene physically unscathed.
I believe in God, and there was nothing but God watching over her during that time. There were bullet holes literally right over top of her head, where her head would have been. Had she had moved any other direction, she would have been killed also.
It seems clear Skuta was targeted. The question is why?
It's a major intersection. There's surveillance cameras in that intersection. And I remember them getting me the surveillance video rather quickly.
We were able to get video footage of Skuta and Sneaky T walking out of Morgan State University, going toward that car. Shortly thereafter, the Nissan Quest following them as they were traveling down Cold Spring Lane, which turns in to Moravia Road. We're able to see the Nissan Quest do an illegal U-turn in the middle of the street and break fast going after them, going in that direction.
But the individual who got out to do the shooting couldn't make out that person very well from it. He saw the Nissan Quest just after the shooting had taken place, coming into the parking lot, backing out, and then fleeing in the opposite direction.
Still recovering from shock, Skuta's girlfriend, Sneaky T, sits down with police.
It was very hot that day. I remember me getting dressed at home. I had a show that day too. He didn't have a show. I had a show. So we was like, we're gonna go to the rally and then chill later until your show. We get to the game and me and my friend go sit in the bleachers. We were just chilling, playing on our phone, taking pictures. They, playing basketball. Nothing weird. It was just a normal day.
When the game ended, Taylor says she and Skuta got back in the car to drive home, but they weren't familiar with the area.
I'm from South and West, and he's from West, so we really didn't have a real good sense of direction of where we were going. We used the GPS to get to the game. So we were leaving the game. I feel like I was typing in an address in my GPS or something. I remember hearing something loud, like a firework. And we both kind of like ducked, like when you hear something loud, like, what was that?
She ducked down, tried to get as small as she could in the vehicle. Thank God she did.
And I heard another one. They kept coming. It's like, five, 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 five. The first shot, it was like a pop, like a pause with it or something. And then the shots kept going. So I just grabbed the door and just jumped out the car. As I got out the car, I was walking backwards. And I could see the shooter had like something white right over his face. But you could tell that he never looked at me when I got out the car. Like never turned or like pointed the gun to me. Like he was determined, like he wanted Scooter. Like he knew what he wanted. And I remember walking like backwards, like crying, like walking backwards, but he was still shooting. Like he didn't stop, like he was still shooting. And then he ran. I knew Scooter was dead because the car started drifting. He couldn't hit the brake. I remember the car crashing and me just like falling to the ground crying. I remember people outside saying like, that's Sneaky T, that's Sneaky T. And I was just screaming, screaming, screaming. And then the police and the ambulance came. I just sat there and just looked at the car and was screaming until the police came. And I remember them dragging him out the car and he had like blood coming out his mouth. And he had blood coming out his mouth, and I was just crying. I was like, is he gonna live? Is he gonna live? Asking the officers, like, is he gonna live? Is he gonna live? And they said, we just gonna get him to the hospital. I heard him get to the hospital. We gonna see. I just knew it wasn't good.
Unfortunately, Sneaky T has no idea who the shooter was or why he went after Scooter. But the news quickly spreads, and the community, often at odds with police, bands together to help find Scooter's killer.
The streets are talking, and we need those streets to talk to us. That's the thing about Baltimore. The people are resilient and always willing to give you another chance. And they rallied around this particular murder because he was relatable, and they saw him as somebody who had survived the odds and was doing the right thing. I think it was just this, we can't believe it. And who would do this?
Right away, the Baltimore police receive a record-breaking number of tips.
Scooter's murder woke the city up.
I had seen more than 300 plus murders in that year, basically. And all the murders that had taken place, I had never seen the abundance of tips that we had in this particular case.
The tips that were coming in ranged from who possibly had set him up to listen to the lyrics of this person rapping.
They wanted to provide things like links to different social media, links to other rappers who had song lyrics that could target Lil Scooter.
A lot of times in the hip hop game, and we've seen this for years. I mean, I grew up with East Coast, West Coast, Biggie, Tupac. You know, lyrics can sometimes get a little rough. And if one group thinks they're being played by another group, sometimes it doesn't stick with just being in the studio. Sometimes things pour out to the streets.
All right, so that's one pair of glasses.
Yep.
With prescription lenses, plus anti-reflective lens coating.
Oh.
Scratch-resistant coating.
Did I choose?
UV protection. Award-winning customer service.
That's me.
That's also me. Free returns, free exchanges, and free frame adjustments for life.
And how much more is that?
Oh, it's all included at Warby Parker.
So my glasses
are still just $95.
Oh.
Surprise! I just get excited.
Your glasses can change the way you see the world. They can be bold, polished, complex, or unexpected. Find your perfect pair at Warby Parker. Or maybe your perspective is artful, simple, sharp, and classic. Find your perfect pair at Warby Parker, starting at $95, including prescription lenses.
All my love scattered everywhere.
When he looked at me, I just melted.
Dreams so sweet turned into a nightmare.
I didn't suspect that he was a straight-out killer demon. I knew I was in trouble. That's a hell of a price to pay. Just for one damn man.
Scooter's death left a gaping hole in the hearts of many Baltimoreans. And that was incredibly evident by the number of people calling into the hotline with tips.
They were young people who didn't necessarily want to physically talk to another human, a detective. They just wanted to provide things like links to different social media. Look at this person. This is the person that did it. We established something very simplistic to make that direct line much easier for people to communicate.
In the days following the shooting of Baltimore rapper Lil Scooter, investigators sift through hundreds of tips from the community. Most are dead ends. But a confidential informant working for police provides them with a name.
The informant reached out to their handlers and immediately told them exactly who was responsible for the shooting. Cortez Mitchell.
Cortez Mitchell is a 22-year-old resident of Glen Burnie, Maryland, a suburb of Baltimore.
Our informant was able to tell us right away that not only did Cortez Mitchell shoot and kill Scooter, he told him where the gun was. It was from there that a search warrant was executed and the gun was located exactly where Cortez Mitchell had advised the informant where it was going to be.
Detectives only have the informant's word that the gun belonged to Mitchell and was the one used to kill Scooter.
Just because an informant says something, we don't go and lock someone up right away. We still have to do an investigation.
You want to send that gun to the lab. You want to match up ballistics. You want to get DNA or fingerprints. Unfortunately, some of these things take time, even if you get it rushed. This is a city now that is on pace for 1,000 shootings and murders every year. 1,000. So that's how much evidence is backlogged. That's how much evidence is being processed on a regular basis.
From this point in time, we want to look into Cortez Mitchell, get all of his background, learn about Cortez Mitchell.
While investigators wait for lab results, they talk to everyone they can find with information about Mitchell and any possible motive he might have had for killing Scooter. They soon discover Mitchell belongs to a different Baltimore rap crew than the one Scooter was in.
Different groups, not necessarily rivals, just different. But once we saw that, we say, okay, this makes sense.
According to court records, the two groups have not always gotten along.
Don't ask me why, just is what it is. Very small, tight-knit communities that stick together. I don't want to portray it as a gang situation. I refuse to do that. It's not that. But there's a lot of stuff that can go along with this.
Scooter rep for his crew till literally the day he died. He loved his guys and he loved his crew.
I met him at a time when he was trying to be the next great artist in Baltimore, you know, and that's all we talked about was him, you know, being successful in making music. And he had a lot of respect for his team. I mean, to my knowledge, he was loyal to a cause that he thought would change his life and the guys around him. And they was hopeful that Scooter could take the brand to that level, you know, the upper echelon, you know what I'm saying, you know, the higher tier premium brand. You know, when you think about these rap labels, you know, that have been successful over the years, they wanted to be that next brand.
Some wonder if Cortez Mitchell was the shooter. Is it possible he gunned Scooter down because of some perceived tension between his crew and Scooter's? Did Cortez Mitchell just want payback?
Casey, welcome to the U.S. Marshals.
Try to keep up. You picked hell of a day to leave the ranch.
All my love scattered everywhere.
When he looked at me, I just melted.
Dreams so sweet turned into a nightmare.
I didn't suspect that he was a straight-out killer demon. I knew I was in trouble. That's a hell of a price to pay. Just for one damn man.
Early in their investigation, Baltimore police have identified 22-year-old Cortez Mitchell as a potential suspect in the murder of local rap star Lord Scooter. Since the two men belong to different crews, detectives believe it's possible Scooter was killed to exact revenge. But what would have motivated Mitchell?
A lot of times, associates might do something that might lead to the person being killed. We were looking for other shootings that may have taken place and see if there was any connections with Scooter's case. That's when we found out about the Devontae Robinson case.
Police reports show that 24-year-old Devontae Robinson was shot in West Baltimore at approximately 1 p.m. on June 25th, only a few hours before Scooter was killed.
Now, according to witnesses of that shooting, Robinson was walking on the street when another man opened fire from a black SUV. Despite being shot 3 times, Robinson survived.
What we come to find out is that Devontae was loosely associated with the rap group of Cortez Mitchell.
Although Robinson's shooter wasn't identified, detectives theorize Mitchell might have believed someone in Scooter's crew was responsible. If one of Scooter's associates shot Robinson, it might explain why Scooter was killed.
Who is his homeboy? That's one of the things that we look for. Like, who's your main man? Who's your ride or die that's going to be with you everywhere you go?
The person who best fits that description is 23-year-old Fred Catchings, a West Baltimore native and Scooter's childhood friend.
Catchings happens to be a close friend of Lil Scooter.
Had Catchings shot Devontae Robinson? Police learned Catchings was at Scooter's side in the hours before Scooter was killed.
What we come to find out is that Scooter was with Fred Catchings at the basketball game.
Catchings ended up leaving the game prior to Sneaky T and Scooter. And given the violence that followed, it's possible he was trying to avoid being ambushed by someone seeking revenge for Robinson's shooting. Instead, he might have gotten his friend killed. As investigators begin the search for Fred Catchings, countless mourners gather to lay Scooter to rest.
Everybody was there. I mean, he had a line all the way down the street. It was beautiful. He looked like he was there asleep, but it was just hurtful, you know, to see a young brother landing like that. It was just unbelievable this kid was gone.
Authorities hope that anyone who feels loyal to Scooter will choose to follow Scooter's path of nonviolence and not continue a cycle of payback.
There was this energy in that space where it was like these individuals were now carrying the torch. That Scooter had done as much as he could while on Earth in his short 23 years of living, and now it was incumbent upon them to take up that mantle. You know, don't let this derail you. Don't let this take you off your mark. Stay in the trenches and let's finish the work that Scooter was doing his best to do in his beloved city.
5 days later, the community is dealt another blow.
Scooter's manager, Trayvon Lee, is gunned down. And he dies from 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, just steps away from his home.
Some wonder if Lee's murder was another attempt at avenging the shooting of Devontae Robinson. That same day, 3 more young men are ambushed by another unidentified shooter. It is unclear whether the shootings are related, but the violence in Baltimore is clearly escalating.
Police here in Baltimore are used to acts of retaliation. But what they learned with this case is that this was payback on a whole nother level.
The trail of violence begins to go back and forth. It was a bloody tennis match going back and forth throughout the city.
This city is definitely an eye for an eye. If you do something to somebody, your family member, somebody is going to get you back.
Desperate to stop the violence, Baltimore police hold a press conference on July 7th.
You can't allow street justice to take place because it's only leaving family without their loved one.
A lot of people sit here and think, oh, you cut me, I cut you. You shoot me, I shoot you. But where do it end? How many people you gonna hurt? How many people gotta suffer for it to end?
Just so you know, supper around here can be kind of an event.
For the bill.
You just have to see it to believe it.
Is this your life all the time?
It's like one big tragic cartoon.
We have lived a fairly blessed life, but we have lost our center as a family. What is your plan? Work on myself? We need to let her fall down. What are your dreams?
I haven't gotten that far.
The worry is what you do next.
We have never been challenged. This would be a challenge.
Your glasses can change the way you see the world. They can be bold, polished, complex, or unexpected. Find your perfect pair at Warby Parker. Or maybe your perspective is artful, simple, sharp, and classic. Find your perfect pair at Warby Parker, starting at $95, including prescription lenses.
All right, so that's 1 pair of glasses. Yep. With prescription lenses, plus anti-reflective lens coating.
Oh.
Scratch-resistant coating.
Did I choose?
UV protection. Award-winning customer service.
That's me.
That's also me. Free returns, free exchanges, and free frame adjustments for life.
And how much more is that?
Oh, it's all included at Warby Parker.
So my glasses
are still just $95.
Oh.
Surprise! I just get excited.
This payback mentality is killing off so much talent. And you're taking food out of kids' mouths because now this parent is gone. They supplied food for all these families. It makes no sense to me.
It's sickening. It's heartbreaking. Everyone wants to get the last word. They don't want the police to be involved in it. They're going to handle it themselves.
It's a disease that has to be stopped.
After the murder of Baltimore rapper Lor Skuta, the city suffers an escalation of gun violence. And investigators are doing everything they can to put a stop to it. So far, they've been unable to locate the man suspected of instigating the cycle of violence with an earlier shooting, Skuta's friend, Fred Catchings. But on July 8th, police catch a break when he's pulled over during a traffic stop.
During that car stop, a gun is recovered. Catchings is placed under arrest, and that gun is linked to the shooting of Devontae Robinson, which took place just hours before and shooting the murder of Skuta. Fred was brought into our homicide office. I stepped in on the interview at that time, going back and forth. Fred began to open up about what took place with Devontae Robinson.
When confronted with the ballistics evidence and surveillance video, Catchings admits to shooting Robinson. He says he believed that Robinson was hired to shoot him, so he wanted to shoot him first.
This was the catalyst to everything taking place afterwards. Fred Catchings just shoots Devontae Robinson.
Allegedly, the man sent to kill Skuta was Robinson's friend, Cortez Mitchell.
Fred Catchings says that while Devontae Robinson was in the hospital recovering from the initial shooting, his friend Cortez Mitchell hit the street looking for revenge. Retaliation needed to be felt. When they found out Skuta was at a public event that day, the peace rally, they wanted to hit him where they knew it would hurt.
What we come to find out is that the shooting of Skuta was in retaliation for what Fred had done to Devontae earlier that day. A payback, 100%.
And I was like, damn, that's kind of messed up. It hurt my feelings even more knowing Skuta wasn't the person or involved in whatever happened earlier that day. I had no idea about nothing, you know, and I could have died with something I had nothing to do with.
Investigators charge Catchings in connection with Devontae Robinson's shooting and turn their focus on Mitchell. When the crime lab completes its tests on the gun recovered after Skuta's shooting, they confirm it was the murder weapon. An informant said Catchings had done it and led them to the gun, but there's no way to prove Mitchell pulled the trigger.
Okay, we've heard that Cortez Mitchell did this. We've matched the ballistics. That still doesn't say Cortez Mitchell did it.
No prints recovered from the gun, but fingerprints are very fragile. They aren't always there. Building a case, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove.
And I think this is a part of a frustration for the public. It's like they say, y'all know who did it. But investigators get one bite at the apple because of double jeopardy. Just because you know who did it, you have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt when you take it into court. And if you don't have it, you can't bring those charges.
As they work to develop more evidence, detectives fear the violence will continue.
Street justice doesn't operate on probable cause or beyond a reasonable doubt.
The streets don't need the same amount of evidence to bring someone to trial. You said he did it. I know he did it. We're going to take care of it ourselves.
On October 10th, 2016, those fears are realized.
Before investigators can make a move to arrest Mitchell, gunfire erupts in West Baltimore once again. Cortez Mitchell and Devontae Robinson were together in a vehicle stopped at a red light when an unknown gunman opened fire, killing Mitchell and wounding Robinson once again.
Cortez Mitchell was shot and killed. Literally the exact same way that Skuta was shot and killed. In a vehicle at a stop. The saying is, if you're going to seek revenge, make sure you dig 2 graves. This is a prime example.
As soon as this happens, you go right back to, this is payback, this is retaliation, this has got to be linked to this event.
Since Cortez Mitchell was the only suspect for the murder of Scooter, his death ends the investigation. But Mitchell was never charged with or found guilty of the crime, and no direct evidence ties him or his crew to Scooter's murder. So plenty of questions remain.
Bringing this case to a close was bittersweet. It was, yes, we wanted to get the person involved in the murder of Scooter. No, we didn't want anyone else to die in the process.
Does that give the family the closure that they need? I don't know. Only they can answer that. Because sometimes you want to see them in court. And it's whether they say, I'm guilty because I did it, or the judge or jury says you're guilty because the evidence says so.
For the community, it's not enough. They want someone to be held accountable, not only for Scooter, but to send the message that continued violence won't be tolerated.
With Scooter's suspected killer now murdered, prosecutors push forward to try Fred Catchings for the initial shooting that allegedly spawned this cycle of payback.
But the violence is far from over. More than a year has passed since the string of shootings that claimed the lives of multiple men, including Baltimore rapper Lil Scooter. And the city is still reeling.
Scooter has so much potential. He had kids like literally passing out like to get next to him. His son was probably about 3 or 4 at the time, and he loved Scooter. Losing him, it's like everybody lost someone that day.
It's a tragedy worsened by the fact that the man who may have set it all in motion was one of Scooter's associates, Fred Catchings.
I didn't know Fred as well as I knew Scooter. From what they say, he was in the streets and he was about his business, but I didn't see that in Scooter. Scooter stood for what he stood for, and if he had an issue, I'm pretty sure he would do whatever it is he had to do, but not just outright just trying to hurt somebody.
Regardless of what you end up doing, you have to watch your circle. And even when you might be making it, it might be some people that still are trapped in that world and lost in that world, and they can bring you down if they're not ready to get out.
Fred Catchings decides to make a deal with prosecutors.
Catchings initially pleads not guilty to charges of attempted murder, but with the evidence and his own admission, he ultimately pleads guilty to 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder and the use of a handgun.
In August 2017, Fred Catchings is sentenced to 32 years in prison. But the cycle of violence doesn't end. In 2019, his intended victim, Devontae Robinson, is targeted by someone else.
Devontae Robinson was later shot and killed, literally in the exact same way that Cortez Mitchell was shot and killed, and Scooter was shot and killed. And we're still looking for the persons responsible for that.
The murders of Devontae Robinson, Cortez Mitchell, and Scooter's manager, Trayvon Lee, remain unsolved.
It's not the closure anyone was looking for, but those who remember Lord Scooter will always find inspiration in his life and his music.
There are certain preludes in life that leads to success, whether it be a better education, a good job. Scooter found a future in his talent as a rapper.
People need to hear his story because, you know, he came from a struggle and survived some things and was trying to do the right thing and show young people the right thing.
I think he's seen what the other side looked like. I think he felt it, he could smell it. And, you know, for him not to be able to complete that task, you know, was unfortunate. Not only for the complexity of that situation, but the entire culture of Baltimore, young men and women.
One thing I will say to up-and-coming artists, the children that look up to artists like Scooter, you don't have to go the street route. There's nothing glorious about starving and selling drugs and killing one another. That's not glorious. What's glorious is being victorious and coming out of it and giving back to your community and getting us all out of that situation. People don't realize when you take a life, you don't just take that life. You take so many other people around in that level.
When you're that close to a person, you're not thinking about money and fame and all that. Hurt is hurt. You can't skip past that. You can lose money, you can get it back. You cannot get back that person that you lost.
I had stopped doing music for a while after that happened. I feel like I'm kind of letting him down though by just pushing my talent aside, not really focusing on music how I should. I kind of got discouraged a little bit. He was my motivation. I miss him.
Miami, Florida is a multicultural mecca with its sun-soaked beaches, legendary food, and electric nightlife. The city attracts tourists from all over the world. It's also one of the most influential sports towns in America. Whether it's the Marlins, Dolphins, Hurricanes, or Heat, Miami's love for its hometown teams and its athletes runs deep. And in 2007, when one of the city's hometown sports heroes is gunned down while defending his young family from a group of brazen killers, a single bullet has devastating consequences for all of Miami. In the late 19th century, the city of Miami sprang up along Florida's east coast seemingly overnight. Its sudden rise to prominence earned it the nickname Magic City. Since then, it has grown from a tourist destination into one of the most culturally diverse and endearing cities in America.
Everyone wants to live in Miami for the music, the culture, the food, the beaches.
There's over 120 languages that you can find here in Miami. There's a uniqueness within each neighborhood that you go to.
Residents from Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean
On the evening of July 22, 2007, the town of Cheshire, Connecticut, looked exactly the way people wanted it to look. Wide streets rested beneath the fading glow of a summer sunset. Front porches stood quietly behind trimmed hedges. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across carefully maintained lawns while the last traces of daylight stretched across rows of peaceful suburban homes. It was the kind of neighborhood where children rode bicycles until dinner, where neighbors greeted one another by name, and where the simple act of leaving a door unlocked did not seem reckless. Safety was not merely expected here. It had become part of daily life. Within a matter of hours, that belief would be shattered forever. Long before the first police siren echoed through the neighborhood, long before television helicopters circled overhead, and long before courtrooms struggled to make sense of what had happened, there was simply another ordinary Sunday evening. Families finished dinner. Televisions glowed softly behind living room windows. Parents prepared for another work week while children thought about summer vacation that still had weeks remaining. Nothing about that night hinted that one household was slowly moving toward one of the most infamous home invasion murders in modern American history. By the following afternoon, 3 members of a single family would be gone. One would survive. And the questions left behind would haunt investigators, emergency responders, legal experts, and an entire nation for years. How could something so devastating unfold over the course of several hours without anyone being able to stop it? Why did the offenders remain inside the home for so long instead of fleeing? Could the outcome have been different? Those questions would become almost as unforgettable as the crime itself. Unlike crimes committed in a sudden burst of violence, this case unfolded slowly. Minute by minute. Hour by hour. Every passing moment created another opportunity for hope, another possibility that someone might intervene before tragedy reached its irreversible conclusion. Yet every minute that passed also brought the family closer to a fate they could never have imagined when they went to bed that evening. The house itself stood on a quiet residential street, blending seamlessly with every other home around it. Nothing about its appearance invited attention. It was not hidden behind gates or surrounded by high walls. It was simply a family home, filled with photographs, books, school projects, birthday memories, and plans for a future that seemed entirely ordinary. That ordinary future would disappear before sunrise. When investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they found themselves piecing together a sequence of events that felt almost impossible to comprehend. The incident lasted far longer than most violent home invasions. Decisions were made. Opportunities appeared and disappeared. Witnesses observed fragments of unusual behavior without knowing the full picture. Emergency calls were placed. Officers responded. Yet the outcome remained devastating. It is easy, years later, to examine every decision with the benefit of hindsight. It is much harder to understand what people knew in each individual moment, when information was incomplete, uncertainty was overwhelming, and every action carried enormous risk. That tension would eventually become one of the defining aspects of this case. For many Americans, the murders represented something deeply unsettling because they challenged a belief that countless families rarely questioned. Home is supposed to be the place where danger ends. Doors close. Curtains are drawn. Children sleep peacefully upstairs while parents prepare for another day. The walls of a house are meant to separate ordinary life from the uncertainty of the outside world. On that July night, those walls offered no protection. The crime would eventually dominate newspaper headlines across the United States. Television anchors spoke about little else for days. Legal commentators debated police tactics. Criminal psychologists examined the offenders' backgrounds, searching for explanations that never fully satisfied anyone. Public discussions extended far beyond one neighborhood in Connecticut, reaching courtrooms, police academies, and legislative chambers. Yet before it became a national story, it was something far more personal. It was a husband expecting another ordinary Monday. A wife finishing weekend errands. 2 daughters enjoying the final weeks of summer. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that suggested their names would soon become known across the country. Every major true crime case contains a moment that feels almost insignificant until viewed through the lens of history. A casual decision. A familiar routine. A place visited hundreds of times before. Looking backward, those ordinary moments seem almost impossibly fragile because we know what follows while the people living them do not. That contrast is what makes this case especially heartbreaking. The family did not wake that morning believing they were entering the final chapter of their lives together. They were making plans instead of memories. Thinking about tomorrow instead of fearing it. Like millions of families every weekend, they assumed the next day would resemble the last. They had no reason to think otherwise. Across town, however, two men were moving toward decisions that would alter countless lives forever. Their actions would leave investigators attempting to reconstruct not only what happened but why events unfolded the way they did. Even after years of testimony, psychological evaluations, and courtroom proceedings, many questions surrounding motive and intent would continue to generate debate. Some crimes appear to follow a straightforward path from intent to action. This one did not. It evolved. It escalated. And with each passing hour, the possibility of a peaceful ending grew smaller. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire case is not simply its brutality but its duration. Time itself became a cruel element of the story. Every hour suggested that rescue might still be possible. Every passing moment encouraged hope that someone would notice, intervene, or interrupt the unfolding nightmare before it reached its conclusion. Hope remained alive until it wasn't. When emergency vehicles finally converged on the neighborhood, they entered a scene that would leave lasting emotional scars on first responders. Investigators accustomed to violent crime found themselves confronting a tragedy whose emotional weight extended well beyond physical evidence. Detectives would spend months reviewing timelines, interviews, forensic reports, surveillance footage, emergency communications, and witness statements, attempting to understand not only what had happened inside the home but whether any moment along the way might have changed the outcome. Those questions still linger today. Because this story is not only about the offenders. It is not only about the investigation. It is about a family whose ordinary life ended in extraordinary circumstances, and about a community forced to confront the realization that unimaginable violence can arrive without warning in places that seem untouched by fear. Before the headlines, before the trials, before the public debates over law enforcement decisions and criminal justice, there was simply a quiet Connecticut neighborhood settling into another peaceful summer night. No flashing lights. No breaking news. No crowds gathering behind police tape. Just silence. And within that silence, the opening moments of a tragedy that would forever change the lives of everyone connected to it had already begun. The first reports that reached the public were fragmented, uncertain, and difficult to reconcile with the reality that investigators were beginning to uncover. A fire had broken out in an affluent neighborhood. Police had responded. A suspect had been taken into custody. Then another. Before long, the headlines evolved from a house fire to a hostage situation, and finally to words that no community ever expects to see associated with its own streets: multiple homicides inside a family home. For the people of Cheshire, the story felt impossible to believe. Residents recognized the address. They recognized the family name. Some had seen members of the Petty family only days before, exchanging greetings at local stores, attending community events, or simply going about the routines that define suburban life. The distance between ordinary life and unimaginable tragedy suddenly seemed frighteningly small. As more verified facts emerged, the timeline itself became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. This was not an event that unfolded in seconds. It stretched across an entire morning, creating a sequence of decisions and responses that would later be examined in extraordinary detail. Investigators would compare witness statements with emergency call logs. Prosecutors would reconstruct movements almost minute by minute. Defense attorneys would challenge interpretations. Journalists would revisit every stage repeatedly, asking whether the tragedy could have ended differently. The answers were never simple. Even years later, discussions surrounding the case would continue to separate two different questions. One concerned criminal responsibility, which the courts ultimately addressed. The other concerned the decisions made during an unfolding emergency, where information was incomplete and every available option carried significant risks. Those conversations would extend well beyond Connecticut, influencing broader debates about hostage response and crisis management. Yet beneath all of those public discussions remained a far more personal reality. A family had been destroyed. Behind every investigative timeline lay ordinary moments that would never happen again. Family dinners, holiday celebrations, graduation ceremonies, conversations that had been postponed because there was always tomorrow. Like so many cases involving sudden violence, the greatest losses were measured not only by lives taken but by futures erased before they could unfold. That is why this story continues to resonate nearly 2 decades later. It is remembered not simply because of the crimes themselves, but because it challenged deeply held assumptions about safety, community, and the meaning of home. It forced countless people to ask uncomfortable questions about how quickly ordinary life can change and how fragile the routines of everyday existence can be. As this documentary unfolds, it will follow the verified sequence of events as investigators reconstructed them, examine the backgrounds of the people involved through the public record, and explore how one summer night became a case studied by law enforcement, legal scholars, and criminologists alike. It is a story grounded in documented evidence, courtroom testimony, and established facts, while recognizing that behind every document and every exhibit were real people whose lives cannot be reduced to headlines. Because before this became a case file, it was a home. Before it became courtroom evidence, it was a family's life. And before it became one of America's most widely discussed home invasion cases, it was simply another quiet Sunday evening that no one believed would be remembered forever. That is where our story truly begins. There is one more reason this case continues to occupy such a powerful place in the history of American criminal investigations. It is not because the offenders were unknown strangers who vanished into the night. It is not because the investigation lasted decades before reaching a conclusion. In fact, the identities of those responsible were established relatively quickly. The evidence would eventually form a clear chain, and the criminal proceedings would become a matter of public record. What has never been simple is understanding how so many irreversible events unfolded within such a compressed span of time. For investigators, every case begins with facts, times, locations, physical evidence, witness statements, surveillance footage, emergency dispatch records. Together, those pieces create a chronology that can withstand scrutiny in court. But facts alone rarely explain the emotional weight of a tragedy. They tell us what happened, not what it felt like for the people living through those moments. That distinction matters. The purpose of revisiting a case like this is not to recreate fear or to sensationalize suffering. It is to understand how an ordinary family became the center of a crime that reshaped conversations about home invasions, hostage response, and public safety. Every document filed in court, every photograph collected by investigators, and every hour of testimony represents an attempt to answer questions that, for the surviving family members and the wider community, could never truly be resolved. As the investigation unfolded, detectives would discover that the story did not begin at the family's front door. It began much earlier, with a series of seemingly ordinary decisions that, at the time, appeared entirely insignificant. A routine shopping trip, a drive home, a neighborhood where people rarely expected danger. None of those moments stood out to anyone who witnessed them. Only later would investigators recognize them as the opening pages of a tragedy already in motion. That is often how major criminal cases are remembered. Looking backward, every ordinary moment appears to carry hidden meaning. Every familiar place seems transformed by what is now known. Yet for the people living those moments, there were no warning signs announcing what lay ahead. The value of hindsight is also its greatest illusion. When people ask how something like this could happen, they are asking a question shaped by information that no one possessed in real time. Detectives had to resist that temptation. Their responsibility was not to speculate but to establish what could be demonstrated through evidence. Piece by piece, They reconstructed a timeline that would later become one of the most closely examined aspects of the entire case. The courtroom would eventually hear testimony about movements, conversations, forensic findings, and documented actions. Attorneys would argue over intent, responsibility, and legal standards. Experts would analyze behavior through the lens of psychology and criminology. Yet none of those proceedings could restore what had been lost. Justice, in cases like this, serves a vital purpose. It establishes accountability. It creates a public record. It allows evidence to replace rumor. But it cannot erase grief. For the community of Cheshire, the case became a dividing line between before and after. Residents spoke of it not simply as a crime, but as an event that permanently altered their sense of security. Neighborhoods that had once felt insulated from violence began to view everyday routines differently. Conversations about locked doors, emergency preparedness, and community vigilance became more common not because fear had become inevitable, but because certainty had disappeared. Perhaps that is the enduring lesson behind this story. Violence does not always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it arrives quietly, crossing paths with ordinary lives in ways that seem impossible until history records them. The people at the center of this case were not public figures. They were a family with routines, responsibilities, and plans for the future, much like countless others across the country. Their story deserves to be remembered not for the notoriety of those who committed the crimes, but for the lives that were forever changed. To understand how that happened, we have to return to the beginning, not to the headlines or the courtroom, but to the final ordinary hours before everything changed. Before investigators arrived. Before reporters gathered outside police lines. Before the case became a national conversation. We begin with a quiet summer evening in Cheshire, where, from every outward appearance, life continued exactly as it always had. No one on those peaceful streets could have imagined that by the following day, their town's name would become known across the United States for reasons no community would ever choose. And with that ordinary evening, the first chapter of this story quietly unfolds. If someone had driven through Cheshire, Connecticut, in the summer of 2007 without knowing its history, there would have been little reason to slow down. The town presented the familiar image of suburban New England, tree-lined streets, well-kept neighborhoods, local businesses where employees recognized regular customers, and schools that formed the center of community life. Located roughly midway between Hartford and New Haven, Cheshire had long been regarded as a place where families settled for stability rather than excitement. It was not a town that regularly appeared in national headlines. Residents often described Cheshire as predictable in the best possible sense of the word. Children played outside during the long summer evenings. Neighbors waved from their driveways. Weekend errands followed familiar routines, and many families had lived in the community for years. While no town is entirely free from crime, violent offenses were comparatively uncommon, reinforcing a shared belief that serious danger was something that happened elsewhere. The Petty family was part of that community. Dr. William Petty Jr. had built a respected career as an endocrinologist, treating patients with diabetes and metabolic disorders. Colleagues described him as dedicated to medicine, known for taking time with patients and maintaining a demanding schedule. Outside the hospital, however, he was simply billed to friends and neighbors, a husband, a father, and someone invested in the life of his hometown. His wife, Jennifer Hawk Petty, was equally active in the community. Friends remembered her as energetic and deeply committed to her family. She balanced the responsibilities of raising two daughters while remaining involved in school activities and local organizations. Those who knew her often recalled her warmth and willingness to help others, qualities that made her well known among parents in Cheshire. Their daughters, Haley and Michaela, were at different stages of growing up but shared the ordinary rhythms of childhood and adolescence. Haley, preparing for her senior year of high school, was an accomplished student with ambitions for college. Michaela, several years younger, enjoyed the freedom of summer vacation and the routines familiar to many 11-year-olds. Family photographs later shown publicly captured birthdays, vacations, school events, and everyday moments that reflected an active and close-knit household. To those outside the family, nothing appeared unusual. The house on Sorghum Mill Drive blended naturally into its surroundings. It was spacious but not extravagant, situated among other homes occupied by families who had chosen the neighborhood for many of the same reasons the Pettys had. The street was quiet, with little traffic beyond residents coming and going. During daylight hours, it was common to see people walking dogs, tending gardens, or talking across neighboring yards. Like many suburban homes built with comfort rather than security in mind, the property reflected an assumption shared by countless American families: home was where people felt safest. That assumption was not unique to Cheshire. Across the United States during the early 2000s, millions of families followed routines that rarely included preparing for a violent home invasion. Alarm systems existed, but many households relied just as much on the character of their neighborhoods. Doors might occasionally be left unlocked. Garage doors remained open while children played outside. The perception of safety was reinforced by years of ordinary experience. For the Petty family, the weekend of July the 21st and 22nd began no differently from countless others. There were errands to run, household responsibilities to manage, and preparations for the coming week. Summer vacation meant different schedules for the children than during the school year, but life continued according to familiar patterns. Nothing in those routines suggested that investigators would soon be reconstructing them in painstaking detail. One of those ordinary activities would later become a key point in the timeline. On the evening of July 22nd, Jennifer Hawk Petty and Michaela went grocery shopping at a local supermarket. By every available account, it was an uneventful trip. They purchased groceries, completed their shopping, and returned home. At the time, there was nothing to distinguish it from countless previous visits. Only later would investigators determine that this routine errand had become the first documented point at which the offenders observed the family. That realization illustrates an uncomfortable truth encountered in many criminal investigations. Events that appear entirely ordinary in the moment may acquire enormous significance only after investigators are able to reconstruct the sequence of what followed. For Jennifer and Michaela, it was simply another stop during an ordinary Sunday evening. For detectives reviewing surveillance footage and witness statements after the crime, it became an important part of establishing the chronology. As daylight faded over Cheshire, the town settled into another quiet summer night. Across neighborhoods, lights came on inside homes. Families finished dinner. Televisions flickered behind windows. Tomorrow promised another Monday, another workday, another ordinary beginning to the week. No one could have known that, before dawn, one family would find itself at the center of a crime that would permanently change not only their own lives, but also the history of the community they called home. The final hours of that Sunday unfolded with the kind of quiet familiarity that rarely earns a second thought. Summer has a way of slowing time in small New England towns. Even as daylight faded, there was still warmth lingering in the air, the trees standing motionless under a pale evening sky. Porch lights began switching on one by one, creating scattered pools of yellow light along residential streets. Inside homes across Cheshire, families settled into routines that had been repeated countless times before. For the Petty family, the evening followed much the same pattern. The groceries had been brought inside. The weekend was drawing to a close. Monday responsibilities waited just beyond the horizon, but they belonged to tomorrow. Like countless households, there was no reason to rush the final hours of the weekend. From the outside, nothing distinguished the Petty residents from the neighboring homes. It was part of a quiet subdivision where houses sat comfortably apart, connected by winding streets rather than busy traffic. Mature trees framed the neighborhood, softening the sounds of passing cars and creating the impression that the outside world remained at a comfortable distance. That sense of familiarity is important because it shaped how investigators later understood the crime. The offenders did not choose a location already associated with violence or disorder. They entered a community that, by most measures, enjoyed a reputation for stability. Residents interviewed afterward repeatedly described the same qualities: peaceful, family-oriented, close-knit. Those descriptions were not simply expressions of grief after the fact. Crime statistics from the period reflected that serious violent incidents were relatively uncommon compared with many larger municipalities. Like many suburban communities, Cheshire had experienced property crimes and other offences over the years, but nothing that prepared its residents for the events of July 23, 2007. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they paid close attention to the hours before the home invasion. Every confirmed movement became part of a larger sequence. Receipts, surveillance footage, witness interviews, and telephone records helped establish where people had been and when. These seemingly ordinary details became essential because criminal investigations rely less on dramatic revelations than on careful reconstruction of verified facts. One of the earliest confirmed moments in that sequence remained the grocery trip Jennifer and Michaela had taken earlier that evening. Surveillance and investigative findings later indicated that the two offenders noticed them during that routine errand and subsequently followed them home. According to the evidence presented during the investigation and trial, what began as an opportunistic decision ultimately developed into the home invasion that followed. That distinction would become significant in court. Prosecutors argued that the crime evolved from an initial intent to commit burglary into a series of increasingly serious offenses. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of motive and intent, but the timeline itself became one of the strongest pieces of the case because it was supported by multiple forms of evidence. For the people who knew the Petit family, however, those legal arguments came much later. At that moment, the family was simply at home. Like many families preparing for the start of another week, there were ordinary expectations about what Monday would bring. Work commitments, summer activities, future plans that extended well beyond the coming days. None of those expectations would survive the night. When criminologists later examined the case, they noted how frequently serious home invasions begin with seemingly mundane observations rather than elaborate planning. Offenders may identify a residence based on convenience, perceived opportunity, or assumptions about valuables. Such crimes often develop rapidly, with decisions made in a short period rather than through months of preparation. Investigators in this case considered those factors as they evaluated the offender's actions leading up to the break-in. Yet understanding how a crime begins does not explain why it escalates. That question would occupy detectives, prosecutors, psychologists, and jurors for years. Court testimony would explore the backgrounds of the offenders, their previous criminal histories, and the choices they made over the course of that night. While the evidence established responsibility, it did not provide simple answers for every decision that followed. The neighborhood itself offered no obvious warning that danger was approaching. Residents who later spoke publicly described sleeping through much of the early morning, unaware that events of extraordinary consequence were unfolding only a short distance away. The contrast between the stillness outside and the crisis developing inside one home became one of the enduring images associated with the case. It is often said that communities remember exactly where they were when they first learned about a defining tragedy. For many people in Cheshire, that memory began not with the crime itself, which occurred behind closed doors, but with the emergency response that followed. Police vehicles, fire apparatus, and news crews would soon transform an otherwise quiet residential street into the focus of national attention. But at this point in the story, none of that had yet occurred. The streets remained quiet. The lights inside neighboring homes gradually went dark. And the Petit family, like countless others across the country on a Sunday night, prepared for what they believed would be another ordinary Monday morning. The significance of those final peaceful hours would only become apparent later, when investigators reconstructed the timeline and the nation sought to understand how such a devastating crime could emerge from circumstances that had appeared so completely ordinary. As midnight approached, Cheshire grew quieter still. The steady rhythm of the day gave way to the slower cadence of the early morning hours. Traffic along the town's roads became sparse. Storefronts had long since closed, and the lights in most office buildings had been switched off. The sounds that remained were the ordinary sounds of a suburban summer night, an occasional passing car, the rustle of leaves stirred by a light breeze, the distant hum of air conditioning units working against the lingering July heat. For most residents, those hours would pass unnoticed. For investigators, however, They would later become the opening minutes of a timeline reconstructed with extraordinary precision. Every major criminal investigation depends on chronology. Detectives seek to answer not only what happened, but when it happened and in what order. The sequence of events can reveal intent, opportunity, and decision-making in ways that individual pieces of evidence cannot. In the Petty case, investigators ultimately relied on a combination of physical evidence, witness statements, surveillance footage, emergency dispatch records, and forensic analysis to establish a timeline that would become central to the prosecution. Yet before any of those records existed, there was only a family asleep in their home. Inside the house, the routines of the day had come to an end. Bedrooms were quiet. The responsibilities of work, school, and everyday life had been set aside until morning. Like millions of households across the country, the home reflected the ordinary rhythms of family life rather than any expectation of danger. It was a place filled with the accumulation of years, photographs, books, school keepsakes, and the countless personal items that quietly tell the story of the people who live there. Those details mattered to investigators not because they advanced the forensic case, but because they reminded everyone involved that the address on Sorghum Mill Drive was more than a location marked on an evidence map. It had been the center of a family's daily life. When the case later reached court, jurors would hear extensive testimony about what occurred during the hours that followed. The evidence would establish the movements of the offenders, the actions taken inside the home, and the sequence leading to their eventual arrest. Much of that evidence came from objective sources rather than speculation, allowing investigators to reconstruct the events with a high degree of confidence. Even so, certain questions would remain beyond the reach of forensic science. Why one decision led to another? Why opportunities to leave were not taken? Why the situation continued to escalate over the course of several hours? Those questions have been explored by legal experts, criminologists, and psychologists alike. While different analyses emphasize different factors, they all begin from the same foundation: the documented evidence collected during the investigation. The public response to the case was shaped not only by the crime itself but also by what it represented. Home invasions occupy a distinct place in public consciousness because they violate a space that people associate with privacy and security. Unlike crimes that occur in public places, they unfold within environments built around trust and routine. That reality contributed to the profound impact this case had on communities far beyond Connecticut. For many viewers following the story in 2007, the details felt unsettling precisely because they were so familiar. Grocery shopping, returning home, locking the door for the night, going to bed with plans for the following morning. These were routines shared by countless families. The case challenged assumptions that those ordinary habits were, by themselves, enough to ensure safety. As this story moves forward, it is important to remember that it is ultimately grounded in people rather than headlines. The legal proceedings, media coverage, and public debates all became significant chapters in the history of the case, but they followed an event that profoundly affected a real family and an entire community. The investigation would eventually answer many factual questions. The courts would determine criminal responsibility. Historians and legal scholars would continue to examine the broader implications for years afterward. But before any of that could happen, there was a single night in July 2007, when an ordinary household settled into sleep without any indication that the coming hours would become part of one of the most closely examined criminal cases in modern American history. That night marks the point where the background gives way to the people at the heart of this story. To understand why this case resonated so deeply across the United States, we must first understand the family whose lives were forever intertwined with it. Their story is not defined solely by the crime that brought national attention to their names, but by the lives they lived before that tragedy ever occurred. In the next chapter, we turn our attention to the people behind the headlines, the individuals whose ordinary dreams, ambitions, and relationships formed the true center of this case. Before the Petty family became known across the United States because of a tragedy, they were simply a family living a life that many people would recognize. Their story was not built around the events of one terrible morning. It was built over years of ordinary moments, family dinners, school activities, medical appointments, weekend errands, conversations around the kitchen table, and plans for a future that seemed full of possibilities. To understand the impact of the crime, it is necessary to first understand who the victims were beyond the headlines. William Petty Jr. was a physician, a father, and a man whose professional life centered around helping others. As an endocrinologist, he spent his days treating patients dealing with complex medical conditions, particularly diabetes and disorders affecting the body's hormonal systems. Medicine required patience, discipline, and compassion, qualities that colleagues and patients often associated with him. To the outside world, William was a respected doctor. Inside his home, however, his identity was much simpler. He was a husband and a father. The role of physician carried responsibility, but the role of parent shaped his life in a more personal way. Friends and acquaintances described someone who valued family deeply, someone who took pride in watching his daughters grow and supporting their interests. Like many parents, he balanced the demands of a career with the responsibilities of raising children, creating a life that revolved around both professional dedication and family commitment. His wife, Jennifer Hawke Petty, was equally central to the family's identity. Jennifer was known in the Cheshire community as a warm and engaged presence. She was not simply someone connected to a successful doctor, she had her own relationships, responsibilities, and contributions. Those who knew her remembered her involvement in the lives of her daughters and her willingness to participate in the activities that shaped their community. She was a mother who paid attention to the details of everyday life, the schedules, the school events, the small conversations that form the foundation of a family. These moments rarely make headlines, but they are the moments that define a person's existence. Jennifer's life reflected the countless roles many parents quietly carry. She was a caregiver, an organizer, a supporter, and a source of stability within the household. The public image that emerged after the crime could never fully capture the years of experiences that came before it. The same is true for their daughters. Hayley Petty was 17 years old at the time of the crime. Like many teenagers approaching adulthood, she was standing at a transition point in her life. High school was nearing its conclusion, and the future was beginning to take shape. College decisions, personal ambitions, friendships, and new opportunities were all part of the world ahead of her. People who knew Hayley described her as a talented and motivated young woman. She was involved in school and had interests that reflected both her personality and her ambitions. She represented a stage of life filled with potential, the period when young people begin imagining who they will become and what paths they may follow. At 17, the future is often measured in possibilities. There are places yet to visit, experiences yet to have, and dreams still being formed. Hayley's life was defined by those possibilities. Her younger sister, Michaela, was 11 years old. At an age where childhood and adolescence begin to overlap, she was still discovering the world around her. She was at a stage where small experiences carried enormous meaning: school friendships, family activities, hobbies, and the everyday excitement of growing up. To those who loved her, Michaela was not a name in a news report. She was a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter, and a child with her own personality and memories. The contrast between the ages of the two sisters was part of what made the loss so painful for those who knew the family. Hayley represented a future that was just beginning to open. Michaela represented a childhood that was still unfolding. Both lives contained years of possibilities that would never come. Families are often remembered through the moments they share. Photographs from before the tragedy showed a household that was active and connected. There were birthdays, vacations, celebrations, and ordinary days captured without any awareness that those images might one day become a record of lives interrupted. That is one of the most difficult realities of studying any case involving victims. The final events often become the most publicly remembered, while the years that came before are less visible. Yet those earlier years are where the true story exists. Jennifer was more than the person investigators identified in a timeline. Hayley was more than a victim listed in court documents. Michaela was more than a child whose name appeared in news reports. They were individuals with relationships, personalities, hopes, and experiences that existed long before July 2007. This distinction became especially important as the case received national attention. Media coverage naturally focused on the shocking circumstances of the crime, the investigation, and the eventual trials. But for the surviving family members and friends, the central reality was different. They were not following a criminal case. They were mourning people they knew and loved. The Petit family had represented something familiar to their community, a family working, learning, growing, and creating memories together. Their lives reflected the quiet achievements that rarely receive public attention but matter deeply to those closest to them. And that is why the story of the victims must come before the story of the crime. Because a tragedy is not measured only by what happened in a single night. It is also measured by everything that existed before it. The conversations that will never happen. The milestones that will never be celebrated. The ordinary days that would have continued if history had taken a different path. Before the investigators arrived, before courtrooms examined evidence, and before the names of the offenders became known nationwide, William, Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela were a family living their lives. They were not symbols. They were not headlines. They were people. The difficulty in telling the story of the Petit family is that the world first learned their names through tragedy. Their identities became connected to a criminal case, a courtroom, and a national conversation about safety and justice. But the years before July 2007 belonged to something much more ordinary and much more meaningful, a family building a life together. Every family has its own language of memories. Certain places carry significance. Certain routines become traditions without anyone intentionally creating them. A familiar meal prepared on a busy evening. A conversation before leaving for school. A parent waiting up after a late event. A child's achievements celebrated not because they appear extraordinary to outsiders, but because they matter deeply to the people who witnessed them. For the Petit family, those moments formed the foundation of their lives. William and Jennifer created a household centered around their children. Their professional responsibilities were demanding, but their family remained at the center of their priorities. Like many parents, they worked to provide stability while also creating an environment where their daughters could grow, explore, and develop their own identities. That balance between responsibility and family life defined much of who they were. William's career in medicine required years of education, training, and commitment. Becoming a physician meant dedicating a significant portion of his life to the care of others. Patients relied on his knowledge during some of their most challenging health struggles. His work demanded attention to detail and the ability to remain calm under pressure. But outside the medical environment, his role was not defined by a title. At home, he was simply Dad. The same person who treated patients during the day was also the person who watched his daughters grow, supported their activities, and shared in the ordinary experiences that make family life meaningful. Jennifer's role within the family was equally significant. Those who knew her described a person who invested herself in the people around her. She was deeply involved in her daughters' lives and in the community where the family had established their home. The work of raising a family often happens quietly. It involves countless decisions that are rarely noticed by anyone outside the household. Organizing schedules. Remembering important dates. Providing encouragement during difficult moments. Celebrating accomplishments that may seem small to others but represent major milestones to a child. Jennifer carried those responsibilities as part of everyday life. Her daughters grew up in a home where their parents supported their development and encouraged them to pursue their interests. Like most young people, they were not defined by one achievement or one description. They were individuals still becoming themselves. Haley, approaching adulthood, was entering a period filled with major decisions. At 17, she stood at the edge of a new chapter. The final years of high school often represent a unique moment in a person's life, still connected to childhood, but increasingly focused on independence. There were questions about the future that every teenager faces. What would the next few years bring? What goals would become reality? What experiences would shape the person she would eventually become? Those questions remained unanswered because her future was taken away before it could unfold. Michaela, 11 years old, was experiencing a different stage of life. She was still in the process of discovering the world around her. Childhood is often defined by curiosity, the excitement of learning something new, developing friendships, and finding interests that may later become lifelong passions. At 11, there is still so much ahead. New school years. New friendships. Family celebrations. Personal discoveries. The ordinary experiences that slowly shape a person's identity. The tragedy of losing a child is not only the loss of the person they are at that moment. It is also the loss of every version of themselves they might have become. For communities affected by crimes involving young victims, this is often one of the most painful realities to understand. The loss extends beyond a single event because the future itself becomes part of what is mourned. In the aftermath of the Petty family murders, many people who never personally knew the family still felt connected to their story. Part of that connection came from recognizing the familiar details of their lives. They were not strangers living an unusual existence. They were a family with routines similar to those of many others. That familiarity made the crime feel especially disturbing. The home invasion did not happen in a distant or unfamiliar environment. It happened in a community that looked like countless communities across America. The family was not defined by danger or conflict. They represented the ordinary hopes and challenges shared by many families. This is why remembering the victims requires looking beyond the final hours of their lives. Jennifer was someone who laughed, planned, cared, and loved. Haley was a young woman with ambitions and possibilities ahead of her. Michaela was a child with experiences still waiting to happen. William was a father, a physician, and a person whose life was changed forever by what occurred. The crime would eventually create a legal record filled with evidence, testimony, and verdicts. But before the legal system examined the actions of the offenders, there was another story that deserved attention, the story of the people whose lives were interrupted. In true crime discussions, there is always a danger that victims become secondary characters in a story dominated by the actions of those who harmed them. The investigation, the suspects, and the courtroom proceedings often receive the greatest attention because those elements create questions that demand answers. But the heart of the story remains with the people who were lost. The Petty family's legacy is not defined only by the circumstances of their deaths. It is also defined by the years they lived, the people they influenced, and the memories preserved by those who loved them. Long after court proceedings ended and headlines faded, that remained the most important truth. They were a family before they became a case. And they deserved to be remembered that way. In the years that followed the tragedy, one of the strongest themes to emerge from the Petty family story was the importance of remembering the people they were before the crime. Public attention naturally moved toward the investigation, the suspects, and the courtroom proceedings. Those elements answered questions about responsibility and justice. But for the people who knew the family personally, the most important memories existed somewhere else. They existed in the years before. They existed in the ordinary moments that never appeared in official records. They existed in the small details that make a family feel like a family. A photograph from a birthday celebration. A conversation after school. A family gathering. A familiar smile. A moment that seemed insignificant at the time but later became something precious because it represented a world that could never return. The tragedy of the Petty family was not only that lives were lost. It was that an entire future disappeared with them. For William Petty, the aftermath meant living with the loss of his wife and daughters while also becoming the surviving connection to their shared life. His experience became one of profound grief, but also one of responsibility. The public often saw him through the narrow lens of the crime, the sole survivor, the witness, the person whose testimony and experience became central to understanding what happened. But before he was any of those things, he was a husband and a father. He was someone who had built a life around the people he loved. Survival in a case like this carries a complicated emotional weight. There is the fact of being alive, but there is also the reality of carrying memories that cannot be shared with the people who created them. Every familiar place, every important date, and every reminder of the past can hold both comfort and pain. For the Petty family's friends and relatives, Remembering Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela became an important part of coping with their absence. Their lives could not be reduced to the circumstances that ended them. They remained present through the stories people told, the memories they preserved, and the impact they had on those around them. This idea of legacy became especially significant after the case faded from daily headlines. Criminal cases often have a clear ending in the eyes of the legal system. Arrests are made. Trials conclude. Sentences are handed down. Court records are finalized. But grief does not follow a courtroom schedule. For families affected by violent crime, the end of a trial does not represent the end of their experience. The legal process may answer questions of guilt and punishment, but it cannot restore what was taken away. The people left behind continue living with memories, anniversaries, and moments when the absence of a loved one becomes impossible to ignore. That reality shaped how many people viewed the Petty family story. The case was not simply about a criminal act committed in a Connecticut neighborhood. It became a reminder of the human lives behind every investigation file. The names written in court documents represented individuals with personal histories, relationships, and dreams. Jennifer Hawk Petty was not remembered only because she was a victim. She was remembered because she was a mother, a wife, a friend, and a member of her community. Haley was not remembered only because she was 17 years old when she died. She was remembered because she was a young person standing at the beginning of adulthood, with hopes and possibilities ahead. Michaela was not remembered only because she was the youngest member of the family. She was remembered because she was a child whose personality, interests, and future mattered to the people who loved her. The way a society remembers victims says something important about how it understands justice. A case can focus on offenders because their actions require explanation and accountability, but remembering victims ensures that the story does not become centered only around those who caused harm. The Petty family's story begins long before the crime and continues long after the courtroom proceedings ended. It continues through charitable work established in their memory. It continues through community efforts created in response to their loss. It continues through the people who knew them and carry their memories forward. In many ways, that is the most meaningful way to understand the victims of this case. Not as names attached to a tragedy, but as people whose lives had value before that tragedy occurred. The house in Cheshire would eventually become known around the world because of what happened inside it. But before investigators marked it as a crime scene, it was a home. It contained years of family history. It held conversations, celebrations, and moments that belonged only to the people who lived there. That is the image that must remain at the center of the story. Not only the darkness of what occurred, but the lives that existed before it. Because every investigation begins with an event. Every trial begins with evidence. But every tragedy begins with people. And the Petty family were people first. The early morning hours of July 23, 2007, began like countless other summer mornings in Cheshire, Connecticut. The town was quiet. Most homes remained dark. The routines of the previous day had ended, and the community was temporarily suspended in that brief period between night and morning when the world seems almost completely still. But inside one home on Sorghum Mill Drive, the course of several lives was about to change forever. According to investigators, the events that unfolded began in the early hours of the morning when Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes entered the Petty residence. Their arrival marked the beginning of a prolonged home invasion that would later become one of the most widely examined criminal cases in Connecticut history. The first moments of any major investigation often contain more questions than answers. Police arriving at a scene do not know the full story. They do not immediately know the sequence of decisions that brought people there, the intentions of those involved, or how the situation will develop. They must work with incomplete information while attempting to protect lives. That uncertainty would become a defining element of the Petty case. The investigation later established that William Petty was initially confronted inside the home and restrained while the offenders continued their actions elsewhere in the residence. Jennifer Hawk Petty and her daughters, Haley and Michaela, were also taken under control as the situation developed into a hostage event. What followed was not a brief encounter. The family remained inside the home for several hours. This passage of time became one of the most significant aspects of the case. In many criminal incidents, events unfold quickly, leaving little opportunity for intervention. Here, however, the timeline extended through the early morning and into daylight hours. The duration of the incident meant that investigators, prosecutors, and the public would later examine every decision, every communication, and every opportunity that existed during that period. For the family, those hours represented an unimaginable experience of uncertainty and fear. For law enforcement, they represented a complex emergency requiring decisions under extreme pressure. For the offenders, they represented a series of choices that would ultimately determine the outcome of the case and their own futures. As investigators reconstructed the events, they found that the offenders did not immediately leave the residence. Instead, they remained there while taking steps that extended the crime beyond an attempted burglary. Items were taken from the home, and the situation escalated into a hostage scenario. One of the most critical developments occurred when Jennifer Hawk Petty was forced to leave the residence and go to a local bank. According to evidence presented later, she was taken there in an effort to obtain money. This decision would become a crucial turning point because it created an opportunity for the outside world to become aware that something was wrong. At the bank, employees noticed that Jennifer's behavior appeared unusual. What might have seemed like a routine transaction under different circumstances carried signs that suggested she was under pressure. The employees' observations and response became one of the key factors that brought law enforcement into the situation. A call was made to emergency services. That call changed the direction of the investigation. Before that moment, the events inside the Petty home were known only to the people directly involved. Afterward, police were aware that a potential hostage situation was occurring. Officers began responding, attempting to gather information and determine the safest way to intervene. The challenge facing law enforcement was one familiar to hostage negotiators and emergency responders around the world: how to act quickly while avoiding actions that could increase danger for those being held inside. In real-time emergencies, decisions are rarely made with complete knowledge. Officers must evaluate what they know, what they do not know, and what risks are associated with each possible action. The information available from the initial emergency call was limited. The situation inside the house remained uncertain. Later, those decisions would become the subject of intense public discussion. Some questioned why police did not immediately enter the home after arriving. Others argued that the officers were facing a difficult situation involving unknown conditions and potential danger to hostages. The debate continued for years because the case represented one of the hardest questions in crisis response. When does immediate action create the best chance of saving lives, and when might it create additional risk? But while those discussions would come later, the immediate reality remained inside the house. The clock continued moving. The neighborhood remained unaware of the events taking place nearby. And the family remained trapped in a situation that would soon reach its devastating conclusion. The significance of the timeline cannot be separated from the human reality behind it. Each hour that passed represented more than a point on a police report. It represented a family waiting, a community unaware, and responders trying to make decisions based on limited information. The Petty case became especially difficult for many people to understand because of this contrast. The outside world continued normally while an extraordinary crisis unfolded behind the walls of an ordinary home. Morning arrived. People began starting their daily routines. Cars moved through the streets. Neighbors went about their plans. And inside the Petty residence, events were moving toward a conclusion that would forever change the lives of everyone connected to the case. As the morning continued, the situation inside the Petty residence became increasingly complex. What had begun as an intrusion into a private home had transformed into a prolonged criminal event involving multiple victims, multiple decisions, and a growing response from law enforcement outside. One of the most important elements in understanding this case is the passage of time. The incident did not happen in a single instant. It unfolded through a series of actions over several hours, creating a situation in which every decision mattered. For investigators looking back afterward, The timeline became the foundation for understanding what occurred. For the people inside the home, however, those same hours represented uncertainty and danger with no clear resolution. Outside the residence, police officers were beginning to gather information. When the emergency call from the bank reached authorities, responders learned that something unusual had occurred during a financial transaction. The information available at that stage was limited, but it suggested that Jennifer Hawk-Petty might not have been acting freely. Officers were then directed toward the Petty home to assess the situation. This was the beginning of a response that would later receive extensive examination. Hostage situations are among the most difficult emergencies for law enforcement because officers must make decisions without knowing everything happening inside. They must consider the possibility that victims are being monitored, that offenders may react unpredictably, and that a rushed action could create additional danger. In the Petty case, officers faced precisely that uncertainty. They knew there was a potential threat. They knew there were people inside the home. But they did not have a complete picture of the conditions within the residence. The distinction between knowing something is wrong and knowing exactly what is happening is one of the greatest challenges in emergency response. A phone call, a witness statement, or a suspicious circumstance may reveal that intervention is needed, but it does not always reveal the safest method of intervention. That uncertainty shaped the police response. The officers positioned themselves near the residence and continued assessing the situation. Their goal was to gather information while attempting to protect the people believed to be inside. The decision-making process during those moments would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire case. Public reaction after a tragedy often focuses on a single question: what should have been done differently? But those questions are usually asked after the outcome is already known. The people making decisions in real time did not have that knowledge. They did not know exactly how much time remained. They did not know precisely where every person was located inside the house. They did not know what actions the offenders might take if they believed police were preparing to enter. Those factors would become central to later reviews and discussions. Meanwhile, inside the home, the offenders continued controlling the situation. Investigators later determined that their actions had moved far beyond the original intent of taking property. The crime had become an extended hostage event with consequences that would reach far beyond that single morning. The choice to keep the family inside the residence rather than immediately leaving became one of the most troubling elements examined during the investigation. Criminal behavior is often studied through patterns of decision-making, and experts later analyzed how an initial offense can escalate when offenders make repeated choices that increase risk and harm. The Petty case demonstrated that escalation clearly. What may have begun as an attempted burglary developed into a far more serious sequence of crimes. Each additional decision created new consequences, narrowing the possibility of a peaceful resolution. For the family, the passage of time meant uncertainty. For police, it meant pressure. For the offenders, it meant a growing chain of actions from which there would be no easy return. As morning moved toward midday, the situation reached its most critical stage. Jennifer Hawk-Petty returned to the home after the bank visit. By this point, law enforcement was already aware that something dangerous might be occurring inside the residence. Officers remained nearby, attempting to manage the situation based on the information they had. The next events would determine the final outcome of the case. Investigators later reconstructed the conclusion through physical evidence, testimony, and forensic findings. They established that after Jennifer returned, the situation inside the home became even more catastrophic. The residence was eventually set on fire, and the offenders fled. For the outside world, the moment the fire became visible was when the hidden crisis became an undeniable emergency. For the people who responded, it was the moment when a rescue situation became a recovery operation. For the community, it was the beginning of a tragedy that would forever change how Cheshire viewed itself. The image of emergency vehicles surrounding a quiet suburban street became one of the defining memories associated with the case. A neighborhood known for its calm appearance was suddenly transformed into a place of investigation, grief, and unanswered questions. Yet even after the immediate crisis ended, the story was far from over. The investigation had only begun. Detectives would now have to determine exactly what happened inside the home, how the offenders were identified, and what evidence could establish the complete chain of events. The hours that followed would reveal the answers. But first, investigators had to enter the scene of the crime and begin the difficult process of reconstructing a tragedy that had unfolded behind closed doors. By the time the crisis at the Petty residence came to an end, the quiet neighborhood that had begun the morning like any other had been transformed into the center of a major criminal investigation. The sounds of emergency response replaced the ordinary rhythm of suburban life. Police officers, firefighters, and investigators moved through a scene that was no longer simply a private home, but the location of a tragedy that would demand answers for years to come. The immediate priority was survival. For emergency responders arriving at the scene, the situation was no longer only about determining what had happened. It was about finding anyone who might still need help. The residence had become an active emergency environment, requiring coordination between multiple agencies and careful attention to safety. Inside the home, investigators would later discover the evidence that allowed them to reconstruct the final stages of the incident. Outside, the community began to realize that something extraordinary had occurred. Neighbors who had started their mornings unaware of any danger suddenly found themselves watching emergency crews arrive. Streets that were normally associated with quiet family life became filled with activity. The contrast was difficult to comprehend. A tragedy of national significance had occurred in a place that looked almost identical to thousands of other American neighborhoods. That contrast became one of the defining elements of the case. The Petty home was not located in an isolated area. It was not a place people expected to become the setting for a crime that would attract national attention. It was a family residence in a community where many people believed they understood the world around them. The events of that morning challenged that sense of certainty. As firefighters worked at the residence and investigators began securing the scene, law enforcement officers also focused on another critical objective: locating the offenders. The investigation moved quickly because the suspects had not disappeared into anonymity. Their actions after leaving the residence created additional evidence and opportunities for police to identify and locate them. Within hours, authorities were able to connect two men, Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes, to the crime. Their arrest brought an immediate sense of relief that the people responsible had been taken into custody. But for investigators, an arrest was only the beginning. A criminal case requires more than identifying suspects. It requires proving what happened through evidence that can withstand examination in court. Detectives needed to preserve the scene, document every relevant detail, collect forensic evidence, and establish the sequence of events beyond reasonable doubt. The home itself became a record of what had occurred. Every room, every object, and every piece of physical evidence could potentially answer questions. Investigators worked to separate facts from assumptions, building a timeline based on what could be demonstrated rather than what people believed might have happened. This process is often invisible to the public. While news coverage focuses on arrests and dramatic moments, much of a major investigation consists of careful, methodical work. Detectives interview witnesses repeatedly. Analysts examine evidence. Prosecutors review reports. Experts interpret findings. The goal is to transform a chaotic event into a clear and legally supported narrative. In the Petty case, that process would continue for months and eventually years as the case moved through the justice system. But before the courtroom battles began, the community had to face the immediate aftermath. For the residents of Cheshire, the crime created a profound sense of grief and disbelief. Many struggled to understand how such a devastating event could occur in their town. The questions were not only about the offenders, but also about safety, awareness, and whether anything could have prevented the outcome. Those questions became part of a larger national conversation. The response by law enforcement during the incident was examined closely. Decisions made during the hostage situation were reviewed by officials, discussed by experts, and debated publicly. Some believed different actions might have changed the result. Others emphasized the complexity of responding to a situation where information is incomplete and lives may depend on every decision. The debate reflected a broader challenge faced by emergency responders everywhere. There are moments when there is no perfect choice, only choices made under pressure with limited knowledge. But beyond the policy discussions and legal analysis, the human impact remained the central reality. A family was gone. A community was grieving. And a surviving member of that family was left to face a future he had never imagined. The days following the crime would bring funerals, investigations, media attention, and the beginning of a long legal process. The names of the victims would be remembered across Connecticut and beyond, while the names of the offenders would become permanently connected to one of the state's most notorious criminal cases. Yet the significance of the case was never only about the actions of the two men responsible. It was about what those actions destroyed. It was about a family whose story had existed long before that morning. It was about a community forced to confront questions it never expected to ask. And it was about the difficult process of searching for truth after something that seemed impossible had become reality. The next stage of the story would move from the emergency response to the investigation itself, the collection of evidence, the examination of suspects, and the painstaking work of determining exactly how a quiet summer night in Cheshire became a case remembered throughout the United States. The morning of July 23, 2007, marked the moment when the hidden tragedy inside the Petit residence became visible to the outside world. Until then, the events had unfolded behind closed doors, known only to the people inside the home and, eventually, the authorities who received the emergency call. Once first responders arrived, the nature of the situation became clear. This was no longer a missing information problem or a possible emergency. It was a crime scene that would require one of the most extensive investigations in Connecticut's recent history. For investigators, the first challenge was understanding what they were looking at. A crime scene does not arrive with a complete explanation. It does not reveal motives, intentions, or the exact sequence of events. It offers fragments. Physical evidence, locations, objects, patterns. Each piece must be carefully examined and placed into context. The Petit residence became the center of that process. Behind the police lines, detectives began the difficult work of documenting the scene. Every investigation begins with preservation. Before conclusions can be reached, evidence must be protected from contamination and carefully recorded. Photographs, measurements, forensic examinations, and reports all become part of a permanent record that allows investigators, attorneys, and courts to later examine what occurred. In a case of this magnitude, every detail matters. The goal was not simply to determine who was responsible. Authorities already had suspects in custody. The larger challenge was reconstructing the entire sequence of events and proving it through evidence. What happened inside the house? How did the offenders move through the residence? What decisions were made during the hours before police arrived? What evidence connected the suspects to each stage of the crime? Those questions would guide the investigation. One of the most important sources of information came from William Petit, the sole survivor of the attack. His account provided investigators with crucial insight into what had occurred before the fire and before the suspects fled. As the investigation developed, his statements became an essential part of understanding the timeline. However, investigators did not rely on any single person's account. Modern criminal investigations are built through the combination of multiple sources. Witness statements are compared against physical evidence. Suspect interviews are examined alongside forensic findings. Digital records, surveillance footage, and documented movements are analyzed to determine whether they support or contradict the established timeline. In the Petit case, the evidence collection process revealed a picture that prosecutors would later present in court, a crime that began as an intrusion into a home and escalated into a prolonged hostage situation with devastating consequences. The discovery phase also focused attention on the two men arrested after the incident, Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes. Their arrest occurred quickly, but investigators still needed to determine the full extent of their involvement. The fact that suspects are identified does not end an investigation. Instead, it begins another stage, building a case that can demonstrate responsibility beyond doubt. Detectives examined the backgrounds of both men, their movements before and after the crime, and the evidence recovered after their arrest. Their connection to the scene, the victims, and the events of that morning became central issues in the investigation. As investigators worked, the public searched for answers. The crime had shocked Cheshire because it appeared to contradict everything residents associated with their community. People wanted to know who the offenders were, how they had been able to enter the home, and whether there had been warning signs that were missed. Those questions would later lead to broader discussions about criminal history, supervision of offenders, and public safety policies. But in the immediate aftermath, detectives focused on facts. The investigation moved carefully from the emotional reality of the tragedy toward the practical requirements of building a criminal case. Evidence had to be collected correctly. Timelines had to be verified. Assumptions had to be separated from conclusions. This methodical approach is often the least visible part of a major investigation. The public sees arrests, press conferences, and courtroom moments. Behind those events, however, are weeks and months of detailed work by investigators, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and other professionals. The Petty case required exactly that level of attention. The crime had created an overwhelming number of questions, but investigators understood that the answers would come only through patience and precision. Every piece of evidence represented a small part of the larger story. Every interview added another perspective. Every verified fact narrowed the distance between uncertainty and understanding. As the investigation continued, authorities began to uncover not only what happened inside the Petty home, but also the paths that led the offenders there. Their backgrounds, previous encounters with law enforcement, and decisions before the crime would become critical elements in explaining how the tragedy unfolded. The next phase of the investigation would move away from the scene itself and toward the people at the center of the case, the suspects, their histories, and the evidence that would eventually determine their fate in court. In the days after the crime, the Petty residence became more than a location. It became the place where investigators attempted to reconstruct a sequence of events that had unfolded over several hours and left behind a trail of evidence, unanswered questions, and profound loss. For detectives, the work was not simply about examining what had happened. It was about understanding how the events developed from the first moments of the intrusion to the final actions before the suspects were captured. Criminal investigations are often described through their most visible moments, the arrest, the trial, the verdict. But the foundation of every successful prosecution is built much earlier, in the quiet and methodical process of collecting and interpreting evidence. At the Petty home, investigators approached the scene with that principle in mind. The residence had to be treated not only as a place where a crime occurred, but as a record of that crime. The arrangement of objects, the condition of rooms, and the physical traces left behind all had potential significance. Investigators photographed and documented the property carefully, preserving information that would later be reviewed by prosecutors, defense attorneys, and experts. Every major criminal case requires investigators to answer the same fundamental questions. What happened? When did it happen? Who was responsible? How can it be proven? In this case, those questions were complicated by the length of the incident. Because the events extended across several hours, investigators had to create a detailed timeline rather than examine a single moment. The timeline became one of the most important parts of the case. The movements of the offenders, the actions of the victims, the emergency response, the escape attempt, the eventual arrests. Each part had to fit together. Investigators also examined the actions of Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes after they left the residence. Their movements following the crime provided additional evidence and helped authorities connect them to the events. The fact that they were apprehended on the same day allowed detectives to begin interviews and evidence collection while memories and physical evidence were still relatively recent. However, identifying suspects was only one stage. The next challenge was understanding the roles each person played. In criminal cases involving multiple offenders, investigators must determine not only who participated, but also how responsibility is divided. Prosecutors later argued that both men were directly involved in the crimes, while the defense teams presented arguments about individual responsibility and circumstances. Those questions would eventually be decided in court. At the investigation stage, detectives focused on gathering facts. They reviewed the backgrounds of both suspects and discovered that neither man was unknown to the criminal justice system. Both had prior criminal histories, including property-related offenses. Those records became an important part of later discussions about supervision, rehabilitation, and public safety. The discovery of those histories added another layer of complexity to the case. For many members of the public, one of the most troubling questions became how individuals with previous criminal involvement could later become responsible for such a serious crime. That question extended beyond the individual offenders and into broader debates about how the justice system manages people after prior convictions. But investigators had a more immediate task: building a case based on what happened on July 23, 2007. As forensic specialists examined the evidence, prosecutors began preparing for what would eventually become lengthy legal proceedings. The amount of attention surrounding the case meant that every aspect would be carefully challenged and examined. The defense would question evidence. The prosecution would present its interpretation. Experts would explain technical findings. Witnesses would recount what they knew. The courtroom would ultimately become the place where competing narratives were tested. But before that happened, investigators needed to establish the basic truth of the case. The evidence showed that the crime was not a random mystery with unknown perpetrators. Instead, it revealed a chain of events involving two identifiable suspects whose actions could be examined through testimony and physical evidence. That clarity did not make the tragedy easier to understand. Knowing who was responsible could answer one question, but it could not answer every emotional question left behind. It could not explain the full impact on the surviving family members, friends, and community. It could not undo the loss. This distinction is important in any major criminal investigation. Solving a case and healing from a case are not the same thing. The arrest of the suspects created a legal pathway toward accountability, but the community of Cheshire was still processing what had happened. Residents continued to ask how such a crime could occur in their town. Families reflected on their own routines and assumptions about safety. Public attention remained focused on the investigation as new details emerged. Meanwhile, detectives continued following the evidence. The next stage would require a deeper examination of the two men at the center of the case, their backgrounds, their previous encounters with the law, and the decisions that ultimately brought them to the Petty home. Understanding the suspects would not excuse their actions. It would, however, help investigators and the public understand the path that led to one of the most significant criminal cases in Connecticut history. As investigators continued working through the evidence, the Petty residence slowly transformed from an active crime scene into something else, a place where a story had to be reconstructed. A crime scene is often described as a collection of evidence, but in reality it is a collection of unanswered questions. Every piece of information creates another possibility that must be tested. Every discovery must be measured against the timeline. Every conclusion must be supported by facts. In the Petty case, investigators faced the difficult task of reconstructing a crime that had developed over many hours and involved multiple locations. The home, the bank, the surrounding neighborhood, the route taken by the suspects after leaving. Each location represented a different part of the same investigation. One of the most important aspects of the discovery phase was establishing the movement of the offenders. Investigators worked to understand how Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes entered the lives of the Petty family, how their actions progressed during the morning, and how their decisions eventually led to their arrests. This required more than simply examining the crime scene. Investigators looked outward as well. They reviewed surveillance footage and witness accounts that could help confirm the timeline. They examined records that documented movements and communications. They compared statements from different sources to determine what could be verified and what required further investigation. This process is often slow because accuracy matters more than speed. A major criminal case cannot be built on assumptions. Prosecutors must be able to demonstrate the connection between evidence and conclusions. Defense attorneys have the right to challenge every part of that connection. Because of this, investigators must approach every detail carefully. The Petit investigation was no exception. The evidence gathered during the early stages would eventually become the foundation for two separate trials. Prosecutors would rely on the collected information to explain the sequence of events to jurors. Defense teams would examine the same evidence from different perspectives, looking for weaknesses or alternative interpretations. That process would take years. But at the beginning, investigators were focused only on discovering what happened. One important part of that effort involved understanding the relationship between the suspects and the crime itself. Authorities examined the backgrounds of both men, including their previous criminal histories, personal circumstances, and decisions leading up to the incident. Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes were not strangers to law enforcement. Both had histories involving criminal behavior, particularly property crimes. Those backgrounds became significant because they influenced later discussions about whether warning signs had existed before the attack. The public reaction to this information was strong. Many people wanted to understand how individuals with previous convictions could later become involved in a crime of such severity. The question became part of a larger national conversation about the criminal justice system, how offenders are monitored, how risks are evaluated, and how society balances rehabilitation with public protection. However, investigators had to separate those broader questions from the immediate evidence. A person's past may provide context. It does not replace proof. The case would ultimately depend on what could be demonstrated about the events of July 23, 2007. As the investigation progressed, the picture became increasingly clear. Authorities established that the two suspects were responsible for the crimes committed at the Petit residence. The evidence collected during the discovery phase provided the framework for the legal proceedings that followed. But even as the investigation moved forward, there remained a deeper challenge. A criminal case can explain actions. It can establish responsibility. It can produce a verdict. But it cannot fully explain the human consequences of those actions. For the community of Cheshire, the investigation was not just a professional process carried out by detectives. It was a search for answers after a devastating loss. Residents wanted to understand what had happened, but they also wanted to understand how something so destructive could happen in a place they considered safe. Those feelings shaped the atmosphere surrounding the case. The investigation became national news. Reporters followed every development. Legal experts analyzed every decision. The public searched for explanations. Yet behind all of that attention remained the same fundamental reality: a family had suffered an unimaginable loss. The evidence would eventually tell the story of the crime. The courtrooms would determine punishment. But before either of those stages could happen, investigators had to complete the difficult work of turning a chaotic and devastating event into a clear, factual record. Piece by piece, they assembled that record. The emergency call. The witness accounts. The physical evidence. The suspect's movements. The timeline. Together, those elements created the foundation of a case that would later become one of the most closely followed criminal trials in Connecticut. And as detectives finished their work at the scene and shifted their attention toward the broader investigation, the focus moved toward the two men whose decisions had set the tragedy in motion. Who were they? What led them to that house? And how did two individuals with criminal histories become responsible for a case that would forever define their names? Those questions would become the center of the next chapter to be why the afternoon of July 23, 2007, the immediate emergency had ended, but the investigation was only beginning. The arrests of Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes provided investigators with something many homicide cases do not have in their earliest hours: identified suspects. Yet experienced detectives understood that an arrest, by itself, is not the same as a prosecutable case. Every allegation would have to be supported by evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court. Every movement would need to be placed on a timeline. Every conclusion would have to be based on documented facts rather than assumption. The investigation therefore entered a new phase. Instead of asking who was responsible, detectives began asking how the crime unfolded, why each decision was made, and what evidence could establish those facts beyond a reasonable doubt. The Connecticut State Police worked alongside local investigators, forensic specialists, and prosecutors. Their first objective was preserving every available source of evidence before time or environmental factors could compromise it. Although the suspects had already been taken into custody, investigators approached the case with the same discipline used in any major homicide investigation. The Petty residence remained under strict control as crime scene technicians continued their examination. Every room was documented. Investigators carefully recorded the location of physical evidence, collected items for laboratory analysis, and photographed the residence from multiple angles. Fire investigators also worked alongside detectives, examining the damage to determine how the fire had developed and whether its origin was consistent with witness statements and other physical findings. Meanwhile, another team focused on reconstructing the suspects' movements before they arrived at the house. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from businesses visited during the evening before the crime. They examined receipts, witness accounts, and available records to determine where Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes had been and how they eventually crossed paths with the Petty family. This effort was important because prosecutors would later need to demonstrate not only what happened inside the home, but also how the sequence of events began. The grocery store visit quickly became a key part of that reconstruction. Evidence indicated that Jennifer Hawk Petty and her daughter Michaela had completed an ordinary shopping trip on the evening of July 22. Investigators concluded that it was there the offenders noticed them and subsequently followed them home. That finding helped establish that the family had not been specifically targeted because of any prior relationship. Instead, the evidence suggested an opportunistic decision that escalated into a far more serious crime. That distinction mattered legally. It helped explain the beginning of the timeline, but it also demonstrated how quickly an apparently ordinary encounter could evolve into a devastating criminal act. At the same time, detectives began interviewing witnesses. Neighbors described what they had observed before emergency vehicles arrived. Bank employees recounted Jennifer Hawk Petty's visit and the concerns that prompted them to contact emergency services. Dispatch records were reviewed to establish exactly when information reached law enforcement and how officers responded. Every statement was compared against physical evidence and other testimony to identify points of agreement or inconsistency. This method of cross-verification is a cornerstone of major investigations. Investigators rarely rely on a single source. Instead, they seek independent pieces of evidence that support one another. When surveillance footage aligns with witness testimony, and both correspond with forensic findings, confidence in the reconstructed timeline increases significantly. William Petty also became a crucial witness. As the sole surviving member of the family, his account helped investigators understand the sequence of events from inside the home. Detectives conducted interviews with care, recognizing both the importance of his testimony and the extraordinary trauma he had experienced. His statements were evaluated alongside the physical evidence to build as accurate a reconstruction as possible. Attention then turned to the suspects themselves. Joshua Komisarjevsky and Stephen Hayes were questioned as part of the investigation. As in many major criminal cases, investigators compared any statements made by the suspects with the objective evidence already collected. Physical evidence, witness accounts, surveillance recordings, and forensic examinations all served as independent points of comparison. This approach serves an important purpose. Memories can be incomplete. Witnesses may observe only part of an event. Suspects may provide accounts that investigators must verify. Forensic evidence, when properly collected and interpreted, provides another layer of information that can either support or contradict those accounts. By combining all of these sources, detectives gradually assembled a detailed chronology of July 23. As that chronology became clearer, prosecutors began working closely with investigators. Their role was not simply to review evidence but to determine how it could be presented effectively and accurately in court. Every exhibit, every witness, and every forensic finding would eventually become part of a legal process designed to establish the facts before a jury. Public attention remained intense throughout this period. News organizations reported each new development as it became available, while residents of Cheshire continued searching for answers. Many wanted to understand not only how the crime occurred but whether there had been opportunities to prevent it. Those broader questions would later influence public debate, but investigators remained focused on a narrower objective, establishing the facts through evidence. By the end of the initial investigative phase, authorities had assembled a substantial body of material. The crime scene examination, witness interviews, forensic analyses, surveillance evidence, and documented timelines all pointed toward the same conclusion regarding responsibility for the crimes. The investigation had moved beyond uncertainty. Now it would move toward prosecution. In the months ahead, attorneys on both sides would examine every piece of evidence collected during these early days. Motions would be filed, experts would be consulted, and the legal battle would begin. What investigators had painstakingly assembled would soon be tested in open court, where every fact, every timeline, and every conclusion would be subject to rigorous examination.